Hello everyone. While we give it a minute to allow people to arrive and sign in, please do use the chat function below to introduce yourself. It would be great to know more about everyone who has joined and your interests in this session. Do make sure to change the chat to all panelists and attendees and not just all panelists so that everyone can see your comments. Welcome to the Customary Laws of the Sea and the Legacy of Colonisation event. My name is David Wilson. I am a maritime historian at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and I am also a researcher as part of One Ocean Hub. While people join and introduce themselves in the chat, I thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of background to this event and the research that it is helping to inform. So One Ocean Hub is a global collaborative research project that comprises science, law, art, the humanities and social sciences, and lots of other disciplines, and aims to transform our response to the urgent challenges facing our ocean. Of particular importance to this session is that the Hub strives to empower those communities who are most reliant upon the oceans to inform decisions surrounding ocean governance at different levels. In order to empower ocean-facing communities, meaningfully integrate Indigenous ecological knowledge, and address the injustices and inequalities of the past, it is necessary to gain a nuanced understanding of customary laws of the sea within their localised contexts and situate this understanding within the ongoing history of the dispossession and reclamation of Indigenous people's rights to marine spaces and resources. It is often recognised that colonialism has occurred by sea and also by the sea within coastal regions. But what is not often recognised is what the three presentations preceding this discussion, what they addressed, and that is that colonialism also occurred and occurs at sea and over sea spaces. And like terrestrial spaces, sea spaces have been transformed by colonial processes that gradually moved to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their long-held rights to marine spaces and resources. The sea is also a theatre where Indigenous peoples have contested, resisted and engaged with colonialism. This World Oceans Week is a perfect opportunity to reflect on and contemplate that fact, especially as we consider the ways in which we can move towards a more sustainable ocean. Over the next hour, we have the opportunity to discuss a number of the issues related to customary laws of the sea and colonialism over the sea that were raised by the three fantastic presentations that our panellists have shared with us. A quick bit of housekeeping. Please do raise any questions that have been prompted by the presentations or are prompted throughout the discussion. To do so, use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen and not the chat function. If your question is directed at a specific panel member, then please make sure to mention their name at the start of your question. I will try to make sure that as many questions as possible are asked and answered over the next hour, but I do apologise in advance if there is not quite enough time to answer all your questions. Please do use the chat function, as I said at the beginning, to introduce yourselves, outline your interests in this session, and to make comments throughout and join in the discussion. Okay, to begin, I want to invite each panel member to introduce themselves, and then we will kick off the discussion. So first of all, just go by my screen. Saskia, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure.
And then we'll go to Jackie and then Josh.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Saskia Vermeylen. I work at the University of Strathclyde in the law department. And my research interest is in Indigenous legal theory. And I'm particularly interested in researching the performative praxis of Indigenous legal theory. And maybe an easy way to explain the kind of research that I'm doing is that I'm looking into what maybe for the lawyers amongst us are not the most kind of usual sources of law. So I'm interested in working with rituals, dances, stories, songs, the relationships with non-humans more than humans. So these are for me sources of law that I analyze. Empirically, I've worked mostly with the Sun communities in Southern Africa, but there is also a comparative legal angle, and obviously the paper that I presented is a product of that. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Jackie Sunde and I'm a researcher at the University of Cape Town in the One Ocean Hub research group, and my research interests and work with small-scale fishing communities has centered largely on the governance of marine resources, with a particular interest in living customary law here in South Africa. And I'd particularly like to extend a hello to Vivian in Costa Rica and some of the other friends that I can see that are coming up on the chat who I know through the small-scale fisheries contacts, Buchle and others. Lovely to have you with us. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Josh Reid, and I'm a member of the Snohomish Indian Nation here in the greater Puget Sound area. I'm also the John Calhoun Smith Memorial Endowed Associate Professor of History and American Indian Studies at the University of Washington, where I also direct the study, the Center for the Study of the Pacific Northwest. So my research interests largely focus on indigenous marine space, especially kind of the historical context of that, particularly around intersections of indigenous practices and the environment. My first book, The Sea is My Country, The Maritime World of the Macaws, published in 2015, examines the macaws' historical relationship with the sea. And so the presentation that I recorded for this session drew from some of that research, looking carefully at how one macaw negotiator's acknowledgement that he would fish together with whites transformed into official treaty language to fish in common with, which established what I call a marine settler commons from propertied macaw waters. And I'm very pleased to be here and eager to hear the questions.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for joining. And as I say, please do feel free to raise any questions using the Q&A button below. But to kick off, now that you've all viewed each other's presentations, I wondered whether there was a key issue raised in the other presentations that spoke to an issue that you see as being particularly pertinent to understanding the history and ongoing processes of colonialism and the struggle to recover Indigenous rights over sea spaces. Jackie, we'll go to you first. That's okay.
Thank you, David. Yes, and I think it feels particularly important in this global context where we are seeing racism and the colonial legacy surfacing and resurfacing, and really questions of racism re-emerging. And so I think for me, I mean, it was really fabulous to view Saskia and Josh's presentations coming from my experience in South Africa. And I think the one thing that really stood out for me was this impossibility and sort of difficulty of a Western positivist worldview grappling with the intangible, and particularly with ancestral relation to land and sea country, and rights that arise in terms of that relationship to land and sea country, and the difficulty of trying to translate this, and the almost the challenge of trying to translate something that can't be written, that needs to be embodied and bodied in a very textual way. So I think that really came across for me across all the presentations.
Thanks, Jackie. Who wants to jump in next? Saskia, when you go.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, I also enjoyed very much listening to the presentations of the co-panelists, and I think there was lots of similarities in the kind of issues we are grappling with. And just three things that I would like to emphasize and sort of pick up on some of the wording of the co-panelists. So from what really spoke to me from Josh's presentation was this kind of elimination of existence. I think that really spoke also to my own research, and this silencing of the other, the silencing of voices, the stories, the ways of being that are not just, on different kind of levels. it's the silencing in a particular kind of seascape and landscape, but also the silencing in laws, in texts, etc. So on multiple kind of levels. And then from Jackie, and it's again something that goes across the three presentations, is around the notion of language, and this problem of oral and written cultures. But then within the oral culture, I think what I would like to highlight is that we really seem to struggle to deal with the performative angle of it. And it's more than just an oral culture. I think it's, for me, it's the kind of material performative understanding of Indigenous laws that really, yeah, I think cuts across the three presentation. And then maybe one thing that I would like to highlight from my own one, but obviously also has some links with the two other ones, is this issue of relationality and the problem with Indigenous laws and the translation, and maybe, yeah, also the mistranslation and misrepresentation is trying to convey the relations between humans, non-humans, and more than humans. I think that's a really big kind of issue that really starts to create conflicts and tension with this, what Jackie nicely referred to, this kind of Western positivist law. That's a real, yeah, big issue.
Thanks, Saskia. Josh?
Both very much. Patients, I found rich similarities that make sense as to why David asked the three of us to come in. So one of the things that I was really struck by is how Indigenous people encode knowledge. And some of this Saskia and Jackie have already invoked this morning, kind of this idea of relationality, the situational nature of this encoding of knowledge, that it's very clearly tied to homelands, which obviously in my mind include water. They're experiential, they're organic. I forget which one of you invoked this, but the idea of living the law, that there are these practices and kind of daily ways that we can live the law, live Indigenous laws. And I was unsurprised to find yet more ways that settler colonial states dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands, waters, and relations. Whether it be through the marine protected areas down in South Africa, where these Western conservation practices are often very antithetical to Indigenous rights. That's something that we see here in the greater Puget Sound, Sailor Sea area in Washington State and British Columbia, or the example of kind of even practices like mapping Western forms that limit Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous perspectives and beings. But for me, the piece that I would really like to highlight is almost like a counter narrative to what I think I saw in all of our presentations, and that is of Indigenous agency. Our peoples don't just passively accept dispossession and the loss of rights. Jackie's presentation talks very specifically about fighting back in the courts, where these three fishermen and the community itself appealed their case to the higher courts until they got recognition of their customary rights. This is a pattern that I see in both the United States and Canada an awful lot. In Saskia's presentation, I was struck by the way that the community utilized the saltwater collection of bark paintings of sea country to substantiate their claims to managing the sea. And that final example of making judges walk barefoot across this really large canvas to perform the law, did the judges know what they were, did that soak into them at all? Did they have any reflection that that's actually what they were doing? That was a question that I kind of had, is when non-natives are brought into these spaces to perform or engage in Indigenous protocols, are they even aware sometimes that they're doing that?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Josh. But Saskia, would you like to answer that question that Josh raised?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, maybe yes. But to another extent, I think it is very difficult as a non-Indigenous person to really fully understand it. And maybe it's not something that would even be appropriate, I think. But I think having a sort of recognition of these different processes of lawmaking, I think is really very important. But in terms of really understanding the sacredness and the intricacies, I think it's really very, very difficult and would be inappropriate. But I do think that they had an awareness that something really very important was happening there. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. We've got a couple of questions in here from the Q&A, which I'll start going through. But just before we do that, I wanted to kind of pick up on some of the strands that came across from each of the three kind of main points that you put across there, really about the difficulties of translating oral and performative law into this Western positivist law that Jackie mentioned. And I wondered, throughout history and through the regions that you've looked at in the past and present, has the attempts to codify customary law into this positivist legal system led to the invention of a form of static customary law that is not reflective of customary law in practice? It doesn't really embody the dynamic, organic and relational aspects of customary law. And what problems has this created for Indigenous polities past and present? Josh, we'll go to you first. That's okay?
Sure. Yeah, that definitely is a concern to tribal nations here in Western Washington. I'll kind of keep my context to that. There's been a lot of rhetoric that I've heard from Native peoples that even the process of making treaties nailed down certain ideas, concepts, and practices, and just that act alone limited things. So for example, in the treaties, in each of these Stevens treaties that Western Washington tribal nations signed, you've got this language of usual and accustomed places. And, as things were adjudicated from the late 19th century on until the Bolt decision in 1974, there was a lot of concern from Washington State about just where were these usual and accustomed places? Can we map these? Can you show us where you fished and things like that? The reality is that they fished any damn place they wanted to, wherever the fish were showing up. And of course, cycles of fish coming and going changes over time, depending on a whole variety of different situations. And so usual and accustomed was literally anywhere that it made sense at that time. And that alone, that example alone, doesn't translate well to these kind of legal systems that are trying to delineate things that belong to a very specific tribal nation. And overlapping claims, forget about that. That's just too complicated for the law to deal with, in that sense. And so, in a lot of ways, David, this question kind of strikes me as building on, what Jim Scott talks about and seeing like a state and state simplification. That's one of the things that I think Indigenous peoples are really facing, and they continue to face today.
Oh, thank you, Josh. That's great. Jackie, would you like to come on that?
Yes, so in our context in South Africa, it's really interesting and I think quite sad how, in fact, the way in which post-democracy, post the first democratic elections in '94, we actually seeing the impact and effect of attempts at codification having more negative impacts, particularly in the marine space. But I'll come back to that. So, we've got a long history, through colonial times of attempts to codify native law, particularly in the far eastern area of Natal. So there was the Natal Code was brought in the 1890s, where the colonial authorities tried to codify native law. And then from After the Union of South Africa in after 1910, there were similar attempts. So in 1927, the Native Administration Act really started to lay this foundation for a dual system in South Africa, where the authorities were moving towards a very separate form of separate development with a separate, legal system. And so up until then, native law was sort of tolerated as long as it wasn't repugnant. But it focused very much on sort of inter-African affairs. So we start to see the codification of things in relation to, for example, women's position in society. And so inheritance for women was obviously, of course, not possible, and women were not treated as adults. And we see that in fact continued then with, into the 1940s and 50s with the apartheid regime, who continued that, and most importantly, continued this approach of really giving the chiefs power and authority, which they didn't actually have in terms of customary law, so particularly power and authority over land administration. And with the 1950s, 1951, the Bantu Administration Act, and then the whole policy of separate development, which established these separate homelands for African people, where the majority of the population was restricted to sort of 13% of the land. And we see a very separate process of separate development then, and a separate treatment of African law. That's really when the powers of the chiefs were distorted, and we see that distortion started to get built in. But the sad thing is that has continued post-1994 with our Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act of 2003. Those distorted notions of the powers of the chiefs and the role of the chiefs under customary law were actually brought into that statute. And that then has started to shape how the power of the chiefs and authority of the chiefs over land administration is now being conceptualized. That hasn't spilled over directly into the marine space yet, but obviously for many of those communities, the land and the sea are contiguous. And so it is a concern, and particularly in the light of this, of Section 20 in that particular Framework Act, does give the chiefs power over natural resources. So marine resources could fall under that. So what's particularly disturbing is the way in which the accountability of chiefs to their local communities, which existed previously, was eroded, and now it's that lack of accountability that has been built into the statute. So that's sort of, obviously where we see the concerns. The Constitutional Court's been fantastic at obviously challenging some of the gender discrimination and bias, and we've had some very strong, powerful decisions in that regard, but we've got a long way to go.
Thank you, Jackie. And I think that really speaks to Josh's point as well about trying to simplify concepts of law to fit certain notions to make it easier for states, whereas then it's taken away from what that law is actually like in practice, but then has a complete impact on communities by taking away that accountability. And that's really interesting, really important. Saskia, would you like to come in on that?
Thanks. I fully agree with what Jules and Jackie are saying, and maybe not to repeat the same kind of message, what maybe is useful to point out how we maybe can move forward with this challenge of how that through the codification that we're not doing justice to the richness, the fluidity, the situation of these laws. And I think the examples that I gave in my presentation are going into some of that direction, but it's still a long, long, long way to go. But I think particularly like Canada, also Australia, where we see that there are Indigenous lawyers who I think they're going to play such an important role for us to move forward in a better understanding of what Indigenous law is and how it can actually inform positivist law. And I think having more of a dialogue and like in some of Canadian law schools, tort law is being, you know, taught through Indigenous law. So I think also training Western lawyers in Indigenous laws where it is appropriate, I think is a major step forward. And then I also would like to, I think it's also a very important point that we do not have to forget that law, you know, law changed massively during the Enlightenment. And if we go to medieval law, we see practices of a mixed jury system. And I think some of these ideas of having a mixed jury, why would we not have an Indigenous judge sitting on the panel? And I think these are really important steps that we need to take in order for Indigenous law to not be simplified and try to put into a box where it doesn't really fit. And the third point that I would like to make, and some scholars who have worked on customary law and within the framework of legal pluralism, where you get different legal systems coming together, is a lot of them are arguing that actually maybe we need to work with that tension that is being created. And instead of trying to find a universal way of making everything fit together, is why not work with that tension and work with it and see where that gets us. So yeah, these are the 3 points that I would like to add to what Josh and Jackie were already mentioning.
Thank you, Saskia. That's great. I think that idea of
David?
Yeah, Josh, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, there's just one point I'd like to follow up with on what Saskia had said. I completely agree that we need more Indigenous lawyers, more Indigenous judges, and this really gets back to an issue that I think bedevils nearly every kind of Indigenous initiative that I'm seeing here in the United States, and that's of capacity. You know, we need to do more building of capacity within tribal nations so that we have a plethora of people who can serve in all these roles. You know, we need more educated Native peoples to serve as lawyers and judges, to serve in fisheries units in their own tribal nations, even, and all these types of things. So, you know, that's one of those big issues that we have yet to figure out how to surmount.
Thanks, Josh. And this really speaks to a question that's came in from the Q&A from Biola, who asked, how just is the law made by legislatures that do not have any representatives from the Indigenous community, but governs the rights of the community? And I think what you spoke to there sort of answers that to an extent, but I wonder if you wanted to comment back in on that, and also to have a think about what strategies are available and have been available in the past where there hasn't been this capacity. What strategy have Indigenous peoples been able to use to try and reclaim some of their rights? Speaking to that agency that you brought up earlier, Josh, what kind of strategies are available?
Yeah, so recent, you know, I mean, actually it's not just recently, but for a very long time, Native peoples, Native nations here in the United States have oftentimes turned to the courts as they've needed to you know, seek justice. To uphold treaty rights, to push back against legislation that clearly violates those rights, does actual bodily harm, theft of property, you know, kind of all the usual things that, you know, fall into kind of that legal court realm. There's been, you know, in the last, I'd say maybe 15 years or so, there's been a big push to get more Native peoples into things like state legislatures so that they can have a hand in shaping some of the laws that are affecting Native peoples. And in some parts of the country that has, you know, there's rising traction for that, and it's been successful. But you know, again, we're back to that issue of capacity. You know, it's the same handful of people in each tribal nation who are serving in all these different roles. and are now being asked to leave their tribal nations to sit in a state legislature somewhere to help participate in these things. I mean, these are all, absolutely critical issues, but these are some of the ways that I am starting to see. And then, of course, most recently, a lot of youth activism has really helped to push, particularly back against, like Jackie, I was struck by one of the points you raised about kind of this authority of the chiefs and that it's eroded their accountability to communities. That's long been a tension in Indian country here in the United States. And so a lot of youth activism is kind of responding to authorities who seem to be a little too much in bed with the federal government for some reason.
Thank you, Josh. Jackie, do you want to come in on that question?
Yes. So we've actually seen very little activism in the area of sort of marine and fisheries governance, but there's a very rich tradition in relation to the land and restitution of rights in the land sector. And we're starting to see communities taking up legal challenges to challenge chiefs around the imposition of headmen and some of those issues, which certainly some of the fishers are engaged in those struggles. But there's been a real clamping down and a silencing of fishers' voices and issues related to customary rights in the marine space. And it's actually quite strange, because when you trace it back, from 2003, the IUCN World Congress of Parks was held in South Africa. There was a very powerful statement then in 2003, on the importance of recognizing customary rights. And we've had several important CBD meetings in South Africa. There've been a number of moments when you'd think these issues would gain some traction. But in fact, in the marine space, there's been very, very little space for communities. There are a couple of really powerful Black marine scientists that are starting to come to the table now and take an interest in these issues. And obviously, we've got some brilliant Black constitutional judges, constitutional advocates who are keen to take up these cases, but it's still quite a new area in South Africa. But perhaps just to add that one thing that has certainly helped fishers in South Africa is some of the international social movements that have enabled fishers in South Africa to learn about how fishers in other countries have addressed these issues. So particularly through the FAO process of developing the guidelines on tenure, and then also the small-scale fishing guidelines that were adopted in 2014. Several of the South Africans, traditional fishers, participated with international social movements in those advocacy processes and started to learn from others. And I think this comes back to Josh, your point about agency, and it's certainly been very interesting for me to see how the fishers have started to articulate their rights in terms of customary law more and more as they've been exposed to the CBD recognition of customary sustainable use, as they've met fishers from other countries that are starting to express and articulate their rights in these terms. So I think that's a very important part of supporting fishers in order to claim these rights and demand recognition of these rights.
Thanks, Jackie. Saskia, would you like to come in on that as well?
Yeah, sure. I think obviously, the rule of law is one option, but I think we're also dealing here with a really urgent matter, and that is that in a lot of indigenous cultures, language is disappearing. Kids, the schooling of the kids, not being in tune with their own culture, and it's not the community that I talked about in my presentation, but I've just been to Zimbabwe working with the tribe, and I've been in a community where there's only 2 elders still speaking the language, and if we know that the law is in the language. There is a huge urgent issue in terms of language preservation and the cultural practices that we need to make sure that stories are being recorded, that the culture is kept alive. And I think that is a really, really urgent issue. Because if that disappears, it will be really very difficult to, to use the culture in court cases. So I think taking a step back and looking into what needs to be done with a massive sense of urgency is really important.
Thank you, Saskia. And I guess it kind of speaks to I wonder about the frustration that Indigenous communities feel about the need to basically constantly try to translate their own legal systems into the systems of Western positivist law, and how that might impact on the disappearance of such languages and cultures because they have to continually translate these to those legal systems. And this speaks to a question that's come in the Q&A too, which asks, to pick up on Saskia's point on universality, is elevating Indigenous legal systems to the level of Western frameworks ultimately just as or more valuable than such integration? There are countries that recognise plural legal frameworks for marriage and inheritance, for instance. So I wonder what your kind of take on that is rather than integration or assimilation, this idea about elevating Indigenous legal systems.
Yeah, and we see that there are some, like I mentioned in Canada, with educating the Western lawyers in Indigenous law, and also using, and that's something that I do in my own research as well, is trying to understand what Indigenous law, Indigenous legal theory, and the norms and the values that are driving it, how it can actually opens up new areas of being in the world and seeing connections, which are so important if we talk about nature preservation and relationships to the seas. It has so much more to bring to the table than what we give it credit for at the moment. And absolutely, it's not about trying to find a way how these two systems can actually work together, but it's also that we can learn from it. And in that sense, yeah, it's a kind of upscaling, but in my own research, I really started to think differently about the law and how we as society live with each other and live with nature and our connections with the ancestors. It's been, you start to really think differently about positivist law and see where we've made some really crucial mistakes. So I think we definitely can learn from it, absolutely.
Go ahead, Jackie, sorry.
Yes, so I really agree with you, Saskia. And I think, in South Africa, what's very exciting that is emerging is an understanding of customary law as a source of law in and of itself, as an independent source of law. But our Constitutional Court has also recognized that customary law can infuse our law in South Africa, our South African law, our body of law, with very important African philosophical principles, which we can all benefit from. And this really, one can see in one's work with communities, when you kind of ask them to try and explain some of the local customary rules, particularly in the marine space around reciprocity and mutuality, where the community that I presented in this case study, for example, they have unwritten, unspoken laws that they will share their harvest of mussels with their neighbor. In fact, it's customary to pour your mussels out in front of your house. And when neighbors come past, you share with them. And particularly if they are ill or disabled neighbors, you share. And when you try and ask them to tell you about where this idea comes from, they'll say, I don't know, it's just Ubuntu. And now the word Ubuntu has been sort of overused and abused a little bit, but it's remarkable how many how many people, Indigenous people in South Africa, eventually will come down to that. And it's like a grondnorm. I think Saskia speaks of that in her work, that the performativity is also part of that. And certainly in African customary law, in many of the communities with whom I've worked, that principle of mutuality and of deriving your humanity from someone else, you know, that relational ontology is so intrinsic to their everyday lives. And I think this is the kind of principle that we're starting to see filter into some of the constitutional court judgments now. People are recognizing that we can learn so much from customary law. So it's exciting.
Thank you, Jackie. Josh, would you like to come in on that question?
Yeah, I don't really have too much to say beyond it seems like an awful long way to go here in the United States, simply because of the way that, you know, kind of the US legal system is really based on individual rights, whereas a lot of indigenous legal governance concepts and things like that are based around the community, reciprocity, balance. Like none of that is, well, it's not very meaningful or of value in the US legal system because it's so rooted in the rights of the individual, which generally is a really good thing. But you know, it doesn't always align well with indigenous values.
Could I just maybe pick up on that point? I fully agree and endorse that, but I do think that there are sometimes allies as well within, I'm just thinking of the work of Singer, for example, who writes about that, that even though we have individual property rights, that there is also a flip side, that there is a lot of kind of obligations as well. And what he does really nicely is to point out that even within our Western laws, there are inroads, there are moments where we do see you know, more radical kind of ideas emerging as well that could align and become sort of allies of indigenous peoples, and particularly around property rights. There is some really interesting body of scholars working around progressive property rights, which are not, you know, that different from what indigenous peoples are arguing for. So I think that's also something that maybe we should pay more attention, that not constantly maybe dividing the two, but look for our allies and pick them carefully.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, but I've also, you know, been thinking long and hard about how even something that seems pretty important and straightforward, like the Violence Against Women Act, how that rolls out in tribal nations, allowing for tribes to prosecute people who commit horrible crimes on those reservations, and the whole system that the federal government or the Department of Justice requires tribes to have in place so that they can just prosecute crime on their own, you know, territories. And, you know, the bar is extraordinarily high, back to that capacity building bit, where it just makes it meaningless. They're not able to. You know, yet I think that there are, Saskia, I think you're right, that there are other avenues where some of this is making some inroads.
Thank you. That's really interesting. It speaks to the importance of context as well, and understanding the different legal systems across the world where indigenous peoples are having to engage with, and just how different it is and how much localized context is important to really gain any understanding or a nuanced understanding of the strategies that are available to indigenous peoples. Right. There's a really interesting question that's come in here, which kind of speaks to what we've just been discussing. And I would love to ask each of the panelists if they could impart advice for young lawyers or policymakers. What is one critical capacity that they need to hone to become better allies to indigenous communities and the more than human? Jackie, I'll kick off with that.
Well, what comes to mind is something that both Josh and Saskia have touched on, and I think David, you touched on in some questions that you shared with us, is this issue of recognition of law. Is that enough? And in my experience from my work and listening to Indigenous peoples in South Africa, I've really seen that just recognition isn't enough, that creating opportunities for perhaps some of what Saskia shared with us, that the performance and the opportunity to engage is so critical. And I saw that in the case that I presented in the case study, having the opportunity actually to perform in court, ironically, even though it was a criminal case, really enabled that community to feel heard, ironically, even in the criminal case in the magistrate's court. And so for young lawyers setting out, I would say to seek opportunities to observe, to immerse themselves, to listen to Indigenous communities in their own context, on their own terms, and to listen and just immerse themselves as much as they can. And to realize that just recognition in the Constitution isn't sufficient. One's got to create opportunities for dialogue and to learn and share.
Thanks, Jackie. Saskia, do you want to come in on that too?
Yeah, I fully agree with what Jackie is saying, and I think it's almost like being humble and showing humility, and what Jackie was saying, the careful listening and the slowness of the research that you need to do, and being gentle and open and respectful, and be allowed to be mesmerized, but also feeling lost. It's if I sort of think back on in first sort of field work that I did, I just couldn't understand anything, and trying to not to panic if you these are very difficult kind of concepts we work with. But yeah, I think being humble, listening, and becoming a very critical friend, and maybe being a good mediator between these two worlds could be really very important.
Thank you, Saskia. Josh?
Yeah, I agree fully with what both Jackie and Saskia have raised, about the important point of listening, which in my experience gets back to relationships. You've got to build relationships with Indigenous communities. That takes time and takes a long-term commitment. And that, I think, better enables a person to listen and be humble and understand some of these concepts. But I think one of the other points, and David and other fellow historians will love this, but you got to know your history of what these Native nations, Indigenous peoples, these communities are facing. You have to have a better understanding of how settler colonialism has taken hold and how it has dispossessed Native peoples and continues to do so. And without that historical understanding, this is where people then make faulty assumptions about treaties and treaty rights, thinking that these were gifts from the federal government, gifts from the nation state, not that these are foundational documents in which Native negotiators reserved rights for themselves, and surprise, surprise, extended rights to the newcomers. And so not really having any historical understanding of that really makes it, I think, even more challenging to be in the space, to be able to listen, to be able to be a good relation to Indigenous peoples.
Thanks, Josh. I think that's a really important discussion, and just understanding that feeling heard and seeking out and listening to communities, but also taking the time to learn that history and really engage yourself with it and immerse yourself in it to actually be able to even begin to speak to some of these issues. That's really important. There's quite a few questions here. What I wanted to ask, we've got 10 minutes left, so before we run out of time, I really wanted to ask, given that the overarching theme of this year's World Oceans Day is innovation for a sustainable ocean, I wanted to ask about the idea of a sustainable ocean, and if that does raise any concerns or challenges surrounding customary laws of the sea and Indigenous marine rights based on the research that you have presented, particularly thinking about ideas of conservation and protected areas and how that has in the past often been a tool that has eliminated Indigenous space and people's rights. Josh, would you like to kick us off with that one?
Sure. Yeah, this is a big concern to Native nations, that I work with here in Western Washington. And I think what it gets to is, kind of this issue of who decides and defines sustainability, who controls it and manages it and legislates it and enacts it. And it's not anywhere near enough to, in at least the context here of the United States, to just kind of say, well, let's just bring all the stakeholders to the table, and Indigenous peoples are just stakeholders. So that stakeholder language of participation in the kind of this neoliberal settler colonial nation state just does not work, especially in a place like the United States, where Native nations are in treaty relations with the United States. And so oftentimes what we see here is, clear lines of tension between conservation policies, usually based in some very rational sustainability, number crunching, counting kind of metric, versus an Indigenous form of relationality with these very same spaces, with these very same ecologies, if we want to use that Western sciencey word, that there just isn't room to accommodate that oftentimes, or it takes a long time to get to that. Yeah, so that's clearly a problem.
Thanks, Josh. Saskia, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, fully agree with Josh there. And I think the notion of language, the terminology we are using is very problematic. I think sustainability does come with its own baggage, and yeah, this sort of neoliberal approach in how often sustainability has been conceptualized. So I think a more careful wording of what we want to achieve, and maybe not pushing through our agenda around sustainability and using these kind of words, and maybe first having sitting around the table, or sitting around, or sitting in a boat and going onto the sea and trying to find a language where you can meet each other and where you can show respect on what you're trying to do, I think is really very, very important. So for me, the language is already comes with a very problematic history, and that doesn't give them trust to Indigenous peoples, because they feel they have to speak a certain language. With that comes a certain expectation, a certain performance, and they know well, what all this is about. So I think it's question of, yeah, almost like disrespect if we keep using that kind of language. So yeah, language is for me a really important part of this.
Thanks, Saskia. Jackie, would you like to?
Yes, I mean, I think Josh and Saskia really said it all, and it's interesting when I've asked many of the Indigenous communities here, the term that they use for sustainability in the African language is more akin to care for. So they'll talk about ukulonda laws, to care for. And ironically, and it angers them because their right to care for their sea and coastline has been taken away. They've been dispossessed of that right to manage and to co-manage and to care. And so I think that on that level, there are a number of challenges really around this issue of sustainability. And then, from their perspective, it raises the question of legitimacy, because if they have been excluded, they don't see the laws that are being pushed onto them as in order to promote sustainability as legitimate. And this tends to lead to their criminalization and, you know, further exclusion. So it's a real tension. When you talk to the marine scientists, they immediately raise this issue of sustainability. And if you allow people to you know, co-manage or manage their own lands and seas in terms of customary law, will it be sustainable? And there's this racist sort of fear, and the issues that are summed up, oh, you're opening the floodgates, and you know, there's so many people that will claim customary rights, and it's a real problem here in South Africa. But I think one of the real challenges is the tendency to evoke the public good. So it's an issue of sort of coherence across scales. So whereas local communities are custodians of their own coast and waters, and that's often been taken away from them. We need that in the face of climate change now more than ever. We need their local ecological knowledge. They are the best possible custodians of those waters, and yet they're being denied that, and we're being denied their knowledge. And I think that's a real problem for long-term sustainability. But of course, the other side is you have people arguing, but in terms of the greater public good, some of their seas should be protected, you know, under marine protected area status, you know, in terms of the greater public good and under the custodianship of the state president. So yeah, I think we've got a lot of work to still do around this issue.
Thanks, Jackie. And I guess to come back to your point about this public perception of these issues and of granting custodianship, of recognising custodianship of Indigenous peoples to marine spaces and land spaces. I guess from the other two contexts that we've looked at, has there been similar kind of pushback and racist language used within similar contexts of debates surrounding sustainability and Indigenous rights? And do you find that that's changing, or do you find that that is still very much the same? Josh, go first.
Yeah, here we'll go into hour number 2, and I'll take it all. This brings to mind kind of the issues around contemporary macaw whaling. So this is where that racist language eagerly seems to explode out of nowhere. You know, whenever macaws, you know, start to gain some traction at exercising their treaty right to hunt whales once again. So that is definitely a key part of it here. I think I'll just kind of leave it at that in the interest of time.
Thanks, Josh. Saskia, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I think it's still there. I think we can be really short in that answer, unfortunately. And if anything, the way of the current kind of geopolitics, I think we're actually regressing instead of progressing, and that's a really big worry.
Jackie, do you want to speak more on that, or no? Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. And Josh, from your book, The Sea is My Country, when you discuss activist groups, animal rights activist groups, and their role in trying to oppose the macaw whaling rights, it's such an interesting and problematic issue around media and perceptions, which I think is something that we should all read into a bit further. And on that note about reading into things a bit further, before we close off, I wanted to ask if there are any books that you would recommend for those who are interested in this topic and who want to kind of explore further, particularly ideas about history and learning from this history. Are there any books that you would recommend to explore these issues further? Feel free to promote your own work as well, please do. Saskia.
Yeah, so in terms which really speaks to the presentation I gave is Anchor's book on Declaration of Independence and Nonnie Sharp's Saltwater People. But I also think that we need to sort of be more critical about our own history of lawmaking, And I would like to recommend Peter Fitzpatrick's on the mythology of modern law. I think is a really good book for that. And then I think what has been really helpful for me is to read Indigenous stories, poetry, just to get into the culture.
Thanks, Saskia. Jackie, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, I mean, I've really found it very helpful to read the very rich literature that coming from the Pacific around in Fiji and other places where they've done a lot of work on trying to develop hybrid systems of marine resource governance that integrate customary law, others that have, had sort of apart but together processes. So yeah, there's quite a bit of work, and I know that some of our colleagues, I think, have been involved in this work from, this is quite old now, but some of the colleagues who are on the discussion tonight have been involved. But I mean, there's a rich history, I think, of starting to, a rich literature of starting to explore these processes in relation to small scale and traditional fishing communities. And then in South Africa, the work by Ninka Claessens and Ben Cousins and others sort of looking at the sort of land and custom and power issues, although they don't explicitly deal with issues related to sea country, unfortunately. There's very little in South Africa that has documented these processes, but all I can say is that watch the space that the colleagues who I know are on the One Ocean Hub group who are with us tonight, and or for some of you this morning, work that some of the colleagues from Rhodes University and Nelson Mandela University and other One Ocean Hub groups are working on, I think, is going to be very exciting in trying to really take this issue further.
Thanks, Jackie. Josh, would you like to give your recommendations?
Yeah, and I just sent them out over chat so that people have that list if need be. I don't know if you have an opportunity, Saskia and Jackie, to also send it out that way. That might be a good idea.
Yeah,
I was busy typing instead of writing it down. Some of the books that come to my attention very recently, Bathsheba Demuth has published The Floating Coast, which is just absolutely brilliant. It looks at kind of marine issues in the Arctic relative to climate change, among other things, and it's a very beautiful comparison of the United States and the Soviet Union and their management of indigenous Arctic marine-oriented communities. If you want to hear a little bit more about like the fish wars of the 1960s and 1970s in Western Washington, all around, activism, around treaty rights. Wilkinson's Messages from Frank's Landing is an excellent place to start. It's also a real good one to use in the classroom for those of you that are looking for texts in that way. And then recently, the Rachel Carson Center, the issue of perspectives, had, I don't think it's the most recent one, it might be the one before that, has a special issue on new whaling histories of the Pacific that emerges from a whaling conference that I participated in a couple of years ago. And there's a range of very interesting topics and articles there. Yeah, and then probably just perusing the work of those of us here in this panel.
Definitely. Listen, well, thank you very much, everyone. I think we're a wee bit over time now, so I just want to take a quick minute to say a huge thank you to our three speakers once again for their fantastic presentations and for joining us for such a fascinating discussion, which I'm sure we could take into hour two without an issue, but we better not. So I think that's left us with a lot to think about and reflect upon as we move forward. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
David.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Josh.
Thanks.
Saskia. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.